I think most of you will be aware of Talk for Writing because it's something that's very, very popular in primary schools. I came across this probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I mentioned it to Wendy in passing. I said, look, let's look into this because it could be something that could be really good for our scheme. And so I nipped up to Newcastle, and I was just bowled over by the fact that the Talk for Writing team were asking people to join in and tell a story. And what they were doing is saying to people, right, we need a horse, we need a giraffe, and all these very enthusiastic primary teachers were just putting their hands up, bounding to the front, making all sorts of animal noises. And I just sat there thinking, this is just incredible, because a lot of secondary teachers would be rather embarrassed about doing this sort of thing. So it really sort of struck a chord with me, how creative and how interactive it was. So we decided to build this into our scheme because it supports language development and understanding in any subject. It's not just language. I do know that the Talk for Writing team have just recently published a book on using this methodology in secondary schools as well as primary. So it is a method that works incredibly well. The idea is to break down the learning into small chunks of teaching. And what we've done is kind of use this in mixed up with other ways, such as Kagan methodology, Gianfranco Conti's style of teaching, and ideas. So a real mix of ways of teaching. But the idea is that you use it to enhance the writing, but doing it through the mode of speaking. And so we've used a lot of high quality models, whether they're stories, whether they're texts, etc. We've used it in a different number of ways. And the idea is really to flood children with key structures to aid them with fluency, with memorization. I think often when we're telling a story, the way Wendy and I have written these stories is lots of repetition, lots of high frequency structures and phrases. And, you know, it's like almost learning the lyrics, the rhythm of a song, is to get them into the flow. So I'm going to show you some examples of how we've done this, and how the Talk for Writing idea is that children do lots of practice together, and then they start to imitate and start to innovate, and then they're led to independent work. So we use the Talk for Writing methodology to really push sound and spelling. So phonics is, as I mentioned earlier, and if you've been on earlier webinars, you'll know it's a very, very strong part of our scheme. It's helping children to memorize keywords and dual coding, the idea that text mapping and using visuals can support memorization of vocabulary, and also to make grammatical structures, complex phrases, more accessible and more memorable. So an example would be, and I know we've shown this in previous webinars, but the idea is to use, for example, storytelling where children listen and they echo the reading. So they hear the teacher, if you're a confident native speaker, or the embedded sound files, children hear the story, they can see from the visuals, and often we use colour coding to really know what's happening in a story. We also use very famous stories, things like Little Red Riding Hood, etc., because we want children to obviously understand some of the stories in advance of actually doing it in the target language. So we hook the learners in by lovely illustrations, native sound speakers, lovely visuals, and then often it leads to text mapping. So that story on the pet shop, as you can see here, the story is on the left-hand side, and the text map on the right, if you're familiar with the way that this works, is that the teacher builds up the text map with the aid of the children, giving ideas on how do you represent that information. So it doesn't just necessarily have to be one word, it can be a series of words, a structure, a phrase, and the idea is to symbolize the words, using symbols, using drawings. It doesn't have to be fancy clip art or anything, it can be very simple. So you can see that story there on the left has been text mapped on the right. This was actually done by an AST in Plymouth, called Louise St. John, who now teaches in Dubai. She's abroad, but she was very successful in showing how you could apply this to foreign language learning. And in fact, we're going to have a look at her delivering this, and apologies if you've already seen this video, but I think it really brings home how powerful this methodology is. So that story is taught in our Year 3 scheme about the 5th or 6th lesson, and Louise here, hopefully you can hear this, is working with Year 3 learners. The text map is on her board, and in addition to text mapping, she uses actions. So let's have a listen to these children. I think that's a lovely video, and obviously there aren't any real words apart from the word but from what I can see on the screen. I think Louise has done a lovely job, and their pronunciation of course is really good as well. So moving on, just some other examples therefore of how we've used this. So this is in Year 4. I know Michael mentioned about using the third person, the he and the she and the it part of verbs. So this is a good example of where children are learning vocabulary to do with food and drink. They're learning days of the week and the third person of the verb manger. And again, they listen to the story, they repeat the story, either listening to the embedded sound file or the teacher leading the listening. Lots of great vocabulary drilling because there's lots of repetition in the key phrases, and again it really helps with that memorization and fluency. So this would be in Year 4 around lesson 10, and then that is the full if you like story, starting with Monday going right back to the following Monday. So it proceeds throughout the week on what this monster eats. And then as you can see here with dual codes, so we're using visuals here to help children retell the story. So this is the innovation stage where they could actually start to replace some of the food items, the vocabulary. And then what we have done more recently throughout lockdown is we've added some extra resources. Just before I move on, that is a very embarrassing picture of me, because what we have done to support teachers who are less confident linguists is I was video doing a Talk for Writing video doing actions to support teachers who want to do a Talk for Writing activity after practicing a story. So you can watch these embarrassing videos of me. But moving on to the sort of more innovative stage, what we've done, and I noticed a lady in the chat box asked about sentence builders. Yes, we've built a lot of sentence builders now into the scheme, as well as more Kagan style activities. So children would then be able to describe much more variety of food items, but also link opinions. So the food and drink sentence builder is just one example of where you bring in the idea of vocabulary and structures within the use of a creative story, and then it leads to more independent learning. So these are just more examples of stories, and also the fact that these stories have Talk for Writing activities with them. So you recognise some of them. We've got 3 Little Pigs, we've got Little Red Riding Hood, we've got some Christmas stories, we've got Mr. Hedgehog, we've got Mr. Gentil and his day out. So you can see beautiful illustrations. Sometimes some of our stories come with PDFs that can be downloaded, printed off and put on, for example, wooden spoons, because we want children to role play some of these stories as well. This would be a Kagan style activity, a quiz trade activity. So sometimes, depending on the story, we might say to the teachers, and obviously in the COVID situation, this may be less accessible now, but often we will take the key phrases from a story, get the kids either to copy them on whiteboards, or you could print them off on bits of paper, and they move around the room testing each other on some of the key phrases. So lots of different ways of going into a sort of Talk for Writing sequence of activities. This is another example. So you can see here, this would be good for 5 or 6, so that when they've learnt the verb aller, they know some of the time phrases, they know country phrases, they know weather, they know vocabulary to do with food and drink, and also mood. And so how would we approach this? So again, what we might do is read this text out and then put some actions together. I'm hoping to do a video of this. I've used this very successfully in year 7 and 8. But those are the kind of key things that we want children to pick up on. So the teacher would read it out, ask the children, do you understand anything? Then put actions to the words or phrases. And then we might play this game. In fact, I was doing this today with some of my learners, is basically to get them to really listen, is to say to them, when you get to the first underlined word, you have to stand up. And then you stay stood up till you get to the next underlined word and you sit down. So they're standing up and sitting down every time there's an underlined word, but obviously they're listening and you're teaching them to recognize how all this language flows together. You do it slowly first and then you do it a little bit faster. I've also played this game where I actually read it in English. And again, I go by plane to Spain for 10 days. So it's really effective as a translation activity as well. I've done speaking trains if I'm confident that their pronunciation is good, because they'll be doing lots of repetition, I would be then asking them in pairs to basically read a chunk of information. So the way this is color coded is in meaningful chunks. So one would go, je vais en avion, the next one would say en Espagne. And sometimes we do it as a race, but only when I'm confident that they can speak. So the learners would work in pairs and race each other to the end and then put their hand up when they're done. This is another way that you could do the Kagan activity, the quiz trade. Again, this text, it's not a story, obviously it's a narrative or an explanation of holidays. You could again cut these up or ask learners to make a note on the particular phrases and walk around the room with their whiteboards. Still on the same text, this was the quite nice way of doing phrase spotting. So again, it's getting children to go back into those meaningful chunks. So I'd be going, on your boards, write me the phrase for I swim, and then I'd box it so that they can see the phrases that I'm referring to. So this is just phrase spotting, and all it is getting students or learners, children, used to good model text, coming back at them in many different ways. Still on the same text, of course, but not getting bored by it because they're practicing it in different ways. Another nice idea would be to take the odd words out and get children then to read to each other the text. It could be that some learners have the text, the full text in their hand, and the other learner has to look at the board and then taking the even words out. So just an odds and evens speaking game. Again, this is now focusing on verbs. Often children say, I don't know what a verb is. I get confused by them. So just getting them to really focus on verbs and doing it as a verb gap fill. And then something I've done very successfully, again, probably, I don't know if this would be possible at the moment, is called a triggers game. Don't do this in an Ofsted inspection because it can be a bit riotous. The idea is that the children put their left hand palm out and their right hand fingers into the palm of the person on their left. Then I would be reading that text and I would be saying to the children, having done the verb gap fill, whenever I say a verb, you have to grab the person's fingers, but also pull your fingers out of your other hand. So for example, they would have to grab the person on the left, their fingers, and pull their right hand out, like pulling a gun out of a holster. It's hilarious, it's really good fun, perhaps not the best thing to be doing at this point in time, but something else that you can do with a text with a particular focus, such as the verbs. And then Talk for Writing, use a methodology where once they've done plenty of practice of a good model text, the idea then is to chunk it, box it up, look at the different aspects and different functions of the language within a text. So you can see that text here is being split up into the time phrases, the verbs or actions, opinion phrases, the nouns, the weather phrases, etc. And then as we move more independently, what we might do then is to bring in more variety to that initial text. So you can see here, trapdoor, telepathy, whatever you'd like to call it. I call it the cloud game. But what's fantastic about this activity is that children, if you've used it before, are recycling over and over again, really assimilating, absorbing, internalising those good key structures and sounds. So obviously, very quickly, if you've not done this before, a learner will start reading from the beginning and they will have to guess what their partner has opted for in the first cloud. If they're correct, they carry on. The minute they get one wrong, then they switch over, but each learner in the pair has to keep going back to the beginning, and they have to memorize what their partner has chosen. They can't write anything down. And then finally, again, we bring in the kind of sentence builder, and this is where we really are helping children to enhance their language. Now, obviously, this would be aimed at the older 5-6 learners, and this is something that we brought more into the mixed age scheme, but it doesn't mean to say you have to be pushing learners to this level. It depends on the group and it depends on you as a teacher. What I've done is where we've got sentence builders, I have had some recordings done, some sound files, so that children can hear how some of these columns have been built together. And the idea is that they listen and they can do a dictation and then they can actually translate it into English as well. So that support mechanism is there, the sound files, every time we have a sentence builder or similar activities.